The night Jabez Hartwell counted his wood was the night he understood that something had gone wrong with the way he thought about being right. It was January of 1892, deep in the kind of cold that Kansas saves for the years it wants people to remember. He sat in his storage shed with a lamp burning low and a piece of paper on his knee, and he did the arithmetic he had been avoiding for 3 days. The numbers came out the same as they had the 2 times before. If the cold held another 6 weeks, he would be burning borrowed fuel in February. He was a man who had lived on this land since 1879, who had survived every winter the plains had thrown at him, who knew cold the way a sailor knows water. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket and sat for a moment in the yellow lamplight. Then he looked out through the small window in the direction he knew even in full dark was west. Half a mile away, a woman he had called foolish 4 months ago was burning through her wood at a rate he could not explain. He could see nothing from where he sat, only dark and the sound of wind working against every surface it could find. But he looked in that direction for a longer time before he turned the lamp down and walked back to his house. That is where this story ends. We have to go back to September to understand how it began. The fire that took the Dunmore farmhouse came in the dry summer of 1891. The way fire comes in dry summers on the Kansas plains, fast and complete, and without any interest in what it was destroying. It started in the roof, and it did not give anyone time to save much. Winifred Dunmore got her children out. She got herself out. Her husband Phineas went back inside for the strongbox that held their land papers and their savings, and the letter his mother had written him before she died, and Phineas Dunmore did not come back out. Jabez Hartwell was the first neighbor to reach the property after the fire, while the timbers were still collapsing into themselves, and the smoke was still rising in that particular black column that means a structure and not just grass. He stood at the edge of the heat and watched what was left of 12 years of someone's life settle into ash, and he felt something in his chest that men of his generation and his temperament did not typically name. He had known Phineas Dunmore since they both arrived in Harlan County, the same autumn, young men with similar ambitions and adjacent plots of ground, and the particular friendship that forms between men who work land close to each other had grown between them over the years, without either of them ever saying much about it. He offered Winifred his house for the night, his barn for the weeks after his help for whatever came next. She thanked him and said no to all of it. He thought she was in shock. He thought she wasn't thinking clearly. He rode home with that heavy thing still sitting in his chest and told his wife Laverna what he had seen, and Laverna listened the way she always listened, which was more carefully than Jabez usually gave her credit for. Winifred Dunmore buried her husband 3 days after the fire in the small cemetery at the edge of town, with the minister saying the words, and most of the county standing in the heat and the dust and trying to find the appropriate expression for a loss of this particular kind. Jabez stood near the back with his hat in his hands. He watched Winifred at the front of the gathering, her daughter Flossie on one side and her son Wilbur on the other, and what he saw troubled him in a way he could not immediately account for. She was not weeping. That was not unusual in itself. Jabez had known frontier women who could hold grief like a stone in the pocket, carrying it without showing it, letting it out in private. But Winifred was not holding back grief. She was looking at the scorched foundation of her farmhouse, the way a man looks at a piece of ground he is planning to break. There was assessment in it. There was calculation. Her eyes moved slowly across the ruins, pausing, moving on, pausing again, as if she were measuring something that nobody else could see. Her daughter Flossie, 9 years old and already carrying her mother's particular quality of directness, tugged at Winifred's sleeve and asked in a whisper loud enough to reach Jabez, "Are you planning something, Mama?" Winifred did not answer immediately. She looked at what was left for another long moment, and then she said simply and quietly, "I'm always planning something." Jabez heard those words and felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the end of August and it was 90 degrees and he was cold for just a moment, though he could not have explained why. What Winifred was remembering, though, no one present could have known. It was a morning 3 winters earlier when a lamb had wandered away from the flock, and she had gone looking for it across the back of the property in the iron cold of a February that had been trying to kill things for 6 consecutive weeks. The lamb had gone toward the old stone grain silo at the far edge of the north pasture, half buried in a rise of earth that some earlier farmer had built up around it decades ago for reasons nobody living could remember. Winifred had pushed the silo door open and stepped inside, and what she found there was not the lamb. What she found was a difference. She could not have called it warmth. It was not warm. It was February in Kansas, and there was no fire in that silo, and there had not been one for years. But it was different from the air outside in a way that stopped her where she stood. The cold inside was quieter than the cold outside. It was as if the cold had traveled a long distance to reach her and had arrived tired. The walls were stone laid thick, perhaps 2 feet deep, and the lower portions of those walls were wrapped in earth that came halfway up their height on the outside. She had pressed her palms flat against the lower stone and felt what the stone was holding, some residue of autumn warmth that the earth and the thickness of the rock were releasing only very slowly, and she stood there for a moment with her hands against the stone and understood something that she did not yet have words for. She found the lamb around the side of the rise unhurt and annoyed at the cold. She carried it back and did not think about the silo again in any deliberate way, but she did not forget the feeling of that stone under her palms. By the first week of October, with the cottonwood leaves going yellow along the creek bottom and the nights carrying their first real edge, Winifred Dunmore had made a decision. The farmhouse was gone. She had the land, 2 children, a mule named Dandy, a wagon of salvaged lumber, some of it charred on the outside but sound at the heart of the wood, and a stone silo that nobody had used in better than a decade. Round, thick-walled, half-buried in its rise of earth, open to the sky at the top, smelling of old wheat and mineral dark. Most people who looked at it saw a ruin. Winifred Dunmore looked at it and remembered what she had felt with her hands against that stone in February, and she saw something else. She began hauling salvaged lumber toward the silo. Jabez Hartwell noticed the wagon tracks from the road on a morning he was moving cattle to the south pasture, and he turned his horse and followed them. He found her working on clearing the interior of the silo, pulling out old debris and rotten wood, while Flossie watched Wilbur and Wilbur tried to help in the way that 6-year-olds help, which is to say with tremendous enthusiasm and limited usefulness. Jabez sat on his horse for a few minutes watching before he said anything. What he saw was a woman in her mid-30s moving with the focused economy of someone who had a plan and was executing it, not someone driven by grief or desperation, but someone working a problem. This was oddly what worried him most. He said what he believed, which was that she had lost her senses. He said a round stone building with no proper floor and no roof, and a hole at the top was no place to winter a family. He said the cold would come through that stone like it wasn't there. He said, and this was the part he would think about later, that she was going to kill those children. Winifred stopped working. She stood with a piece of charred lumber in her hands and looked at Jabez with an expression he had not seen on her face in all the years he had known her. She said, Phineas listened to reason, Jabez. Phineas listened to reason and walked back into a burning house to save a metal box. Don't come here and talk to me about reason. Jabez had no answer for that, not because the logic defeated him, though it did, but because the grief in it was real and the anger in it was real, and the thing underneath both of them, the thing that was neither grief nor anger, was something he recognized as conviction. He had seen it in men he respected. He had not expected to see it here in this context from this person, and not knowing how to proceed, he did what men often do when they are genuinely at a loss. He rode away. He told himself he left because she needed time. He had lived with himself long enough to know that was not quite true. That night, Laverna Hartwell arrived at the silo alone. She had not told Jabez where she was going. She found Winifred sitting outside the silo in the dusk, with her back against the stone, both children asleep in on bedrolls in the cleared interior. Laverna sat down beside her without asking permission. She did not offer opinions about the project. She did not ask about Winifred's plan. She asked the question that Winifred realized only when she heard it she had been waiting for someone to ask. What do you need? Winifred thought about this seriously, the way the question deserved. Then she said, I need people to stop telling me what I'm doing wrong long enough for me to do it right. Laverna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, all right. She sat there for a while longer, not saying much, and then she went home. Winifred watched her ride away and felt something shift slightly in the weight she had been carrying since August. Not lighter exactly, just differently distributed. She kept working. By the middle of October, word had spread through the county in the way that word spreads in country communities, which is thoroughly and without much regard for accuracy. The version that reached town was that the widow Dunmore had gone strange from grief and was trying to live in a grain barrel. Winifred heard this version secondhand and kept working. Then Jabez arrived with Remington. Remington described himself as having experience in construction, which was true as far as it went. He came from town with Jabez and stood outside the silo watching Winifred fit together the beginnings of a roof frame across the open top of the stone cylinder. He studied what she was doing, and then he told Jabez in a tone that did not particularly acknowledge Winifred's presence that the angles were wrong and the whole thing would come down in wind. Winifred set down the piece of lumber she was holding. "Mr. Remington," she said, "which part of the frame do you believe will fail first?" Remington looked at her, visibly surprised to be addressed directly. He pointed to one of the junction points where two angled pieces of lumber met across the curve of the opening. Winifred nodded. She reached into the pile of cut lumber beside her and produced two pieces she had already shaped, fitted them into place at the junction Remington had identified, and showed him how the double joint distributed load in two directions rather than concentrating it at a single point. She did not rush. She explained it the way you explain a thing to someone who is looking at it for the first time but has the capacity to understand it if you give them time. Remington watched. He listened. When she was finished, he stood for a moment without speaking. Then he said he would need to look at it further and rode back to town with Jabez. Jabez, who had been watching not Winifred but Remington during the demonstration, was quiet most of the way back. There was something working in him that he did not examine closely, a faint and uncomfortable question about whether the confidence he had felt when he brought Remington out here had been as well-founded as he had assumed. 2 days later, Remington returned, alone this time without Jabez. Winifred was working on the second layer of the roof frame. Remington stood and watched her work for a while and then said without looking at her directly, "The load distribution on the circle is better than I said it would be." Then he left. Winifred stood with her hammer in her hand and watched him ride away. She was not entirely sure what to do with that. It was not an apology. It was not a concession exactly. It was a man who knew his craft saying a true thing about what he had seen at some cost to himself, because not saying it would have been a different kind of dishonesty. She respected that more than she would have respected a warmer statement more easily given. She went back to work. The month of October moved through itself and into November the way Kansas autumn moves, with increasing urgency and less tolerance for delay. Winifred worked from early light to failing dark most days, and on the days she could not work outside because of rain, she worked inside, laying the raised floor fitting the planking onto the low log supports she had positioned to keep the wood surface off the bare ground. It was Tabitha Kincaid who appeared one morning without announcement, a basket over her arm, and sat down on a stack of lumber and watched Winifred work for the better part of 2 hours without saying anything. Tabitha was Kimball Kincaid's wife, a practical woman who had spent 20 years applying rigorous attention to problems and somewhat less attention to what people thought about her methods. She watched Winifred fit the floorboards, watched how the supports held them above the bare earth, watched how the spaces underneath would fill with dry grass and old burlap for additional separation from the cold ground. Before she left, she said one thing: "The raised floor is the right call. Damp kills faster than cold in a Kansas winter. Most people don't think about the damp." Winifred looked up at her. Tabitha was already picking up her basket. "Thank you," Winifred said. Tabitha nodded and walked back to her horse. Winifred watched her go and felt for the first time in weeks that she had been understood about something specific. She told this to Laverna Hartwell the next time Laverna stopped by, and Laverna said, "Tabitha sees things clearly when she wants to." And there was something in how she said it that suggested Tabitha's clarity was not always welcome in her own household. Now is the moment to explain what Winifred was building and why the people around her could not yet see it, because this is the only time this explanation will be necessary. The old silo's lower walls were stone laid thick 2 feet of rock, set by hands nobody now living could name, and those lower walls were wrapped on 3 sides in the earth of the rise that had been built up around them. Earth that came 5 feet up the exterior surface of the stone. That earth and that thickness were not insulation in the modern sense of the word, but they performed a version of the same function. All through September and October, while the temperature outside moved through its autumn range, the mass of stone and soil had been absorbing the season the way a heavy iron skillet stores heat reluctant to change, slow to release. When the cold of winter came pressing against the outside surface, it would press against material that had months of mild temperature stored inside it and was giving that temperature only very gradually. The round shape of the building meant there were no corners where cold air could pool and settle the way it does in squared rooms, where two walls meet and create a dead space the heat never quite reaches. The stove Winifred would place near the center of the interior, rather than built into an outside wall, the way every fireplace in every house she had ever known was built, would put its warmth directly into the air of the room, the air above the sleeping platforms where the people were, instead of warming a wall that then conducted heat straight outside. The raised floor would keep the cold that naturally settled low off the surface where anyone sat or slept. And the lining she would fit against the inside of the curved walls, salvaged boards in some places, layered burlap stuffed with dry grass, in others would serve the same purpose. A heavy coat serves not generating warmth, but slowing the loss of it. None of these things alone would be enough. All of them together would change what was possible. Winifred knew this not from any book she had read or any school she had attended, but from a lifetime of watching fires behave from 20 minutes with her palms against cold stone in February 3 years before, and from the particular quality of attention that some people bring to problems the rest of us are content to solve the same way they were always solved. The roof frame came together through the first 2 weeks of November. The lumber was laid in overlapping courses across the circular opening, each layer angled to the one beneath it, so that the force of anything pressing down from outside spread evenly around the circumference of the stone walls, rather than concentrating at any point. The shape that Jabez and Remington had seen as a liability was in fact what made this roof possible, because a circle has no weak corners, no points where two walls take unequal load. Winifred covered the frame with planking, and then with sod, she cut from the east side of the rise and fitted together in overlapping courses like shingles, each piece locking the one beneath it against the elements. The work was slow, and it required a precision that Flossie, who had her mother's hands, turned out to be useful for. Wilbur carried things and held things, and was given tasks that were real, because Winifred understood that a 6-year-old who feels useful is a 6-year-old who does not feel afraid. The wind came in early November, one of those prairie winds that announces itself 2 days before it arrives by changing the quality of the light. And when it came, it scattered 3 sections of lumber Winifred had propped against the outside of the silo in preparation for the next day's work. Wilbur ran out to help retrieve them and tripped on something in the dry grass and cut the heel of his hand on a piece of charred wood. The cut was not serious. Winifred cleaned it and wrapped it, and Wilbur was asleep an hour later. But that night, Flossie lay awake on her bedroll after Wilbur had settled, and she said to her mother in the particular voice that children use when they have been holding something all day and can no longer hold it, "If something happens to Wilbur because of this place, I will never forgive you." Winifred sat in the dark with her daughter's words around her and did not answer for a long time, because there was no answer that was both honest and comforting. Flossie was 9, and she was not wrong exactly. Everything Winifred was doing was a wager. She was placing a bet with her children's safety as part of the stake, and the reason she was doing it was that she had felt something under her hands against cold stone and believed it was real. She had not read it in a book. She had not learned it from someone who knew. She had felt it and remembered it and followed the feeling further than anyone around her was willing to follow. She reached out in the dark and found Flossie's hand and held it, and Flossie let her hold it, which was its own kind of answer. Then Reverend Ingram came to call. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November with the manner of a man who had been sent on an errand he was not entirely comfortable with, but believed was necessary. He was the minister of the small church in town, a decent man in his late 50s who had spent his career trying to translate genuine concern into useful action with mixed results in both directions. He told Winifred that the community was worried. He told her that there were people in the county who felt that the children's well-being required more reliable shelter than an unfinished stone building could provide. He told her that the Kincaid family had indicated they had room for Flossie and Wilbur through the winter if Winifred felt she needed time to stabilize her situation. He said all of this with care, with what he clearly believed was tact, and he said it to a woman who was standing in the doorway of a silo that was at that particular moment more finished than it had ever been in her tenure on this land. Winifred let him finish. Then she said, "Reverend, if I were a man building an unusual barn, would you be here right now?" Reverend Ingram did not answer. The question sat between them in the thin November air. He was a man who had thought of himself as fair for his entire adult life, and the question had the particular quality of questions that do not need to be answered to accomplish their purpose. He said he would check in again and rode back toward town, and Winifred watched him go and felt something she had not expected to feel in that moment, which was not triumph but a sudden and vertiginous fear. Because Ingram's visit, which she had deflected, reminded her that the decision she had made was not only hers to bear. That evening, Wilbur climbed into her lap the way he still did sometimes and looked up at her with the complete trust of a 6-year-old who does not yet know that trust can be misplaced, and asked the question he had been carrying in his way, which was simpler and heavier than anything Reverend Ingram had said. "Mama, are we going to be warm?" Winifred held her son and looked at the curve of the stone wall she had lined with boards and burlap, and dry grass at the floor she had raised on its short log supports. At the door she had hung straight and tight on salvaged hinges at the small south-facing window, with its wavy piece of glass letting in the last of the afternoon light. "Yes," she said, "we are going to be warm." She said it with certainty, but that night after the children were asleep, she went out alone, under a sky that was already taking on the flat character. That means hard winter is calculating its arrival, and she walked to the silo and went inside by herself in the dark, and felt her way to the north wall, and pressed both palms flat against the lower stone. It was there the difference she had felt 3 years ago was still there, faint but unmistakable. The stone giving back something the earth and the season had put into it, reluctant to release it, holding it the way stone holds things. She stood in the dark with her hands against the wall for a long time. She was afraid. She was also certain. Both things were true simultaneously, and she had learned in the years since Phineas died that life on this land did not often allow you the luxury of waiting for fear to resolve itself before you had to act. She took her hands off the wall and walked back to where her children were sleeping. The next morning she went back to work. By the 3rd week of November, the silo was finished. Floor-solid door, sealed stove, installed near the center of the space on its flat stone hearth, stovepipe running up through the roof collar of packed clay and salvaged tin. Sleeping platforms along both sides of the curved interior wall raised to keep the people in the warm band of air, rather than on the floor where the cold settled. Wood supply stacked along the north curve. Flossie came in from feeding Dandy one evening when the first real cold of the season had settled across the county, and the temperature had dropped to the point where your breath became visible and the water in the outside trough needed breaking in the morning. She stood in the doorway for a moment before pulling it closed, and the expression on her face was not the expression of a 9-year-old performing observation. It was the genuine surprise of a person encountering something they had not expected. She said, "Mama, it feels like being inside a hill." Winifred looked at her daughter. She looked at the curved stone walls lined in their makeshift coat of boards and burlap, at the small stove ticking steadily in the near center of the room at Wilbur, Bear asleep on his platform, with one arm thrown over his face at the window, with its wavy glass holding the last gray light. She said, "Close the door, Flossie, keep it in." Flossie closed the door. The sound of the wind outside, which had been building all afternoon, became a background presence, rather than an immediate one, something happening at a distance. Inside the silo, the temperature stayed where it was. That same evening, half a mile east, Jabez Hartwell stood in the yard after dark and looked in the direction he knew the silo was, though he could see nothing. He had been doing the calculation in his head all week, the one about how much wood he had and how much winter was likely to remain, and the numbers were beginning to nag at him in a way he was not accustomed to. He was a man who had survived every winter this land had thrown at him, and he knew how to provision for cold, and he was finding this November that his usual calculations were leaving him with less margin than he was used to. He could not have explained precisely why he stood in the dark looking west. He just stood there for a while the way a man stands when something is working in him that he has not yet decided to acknowledge. Then he went inside and the wind picked up and the first real winter settled its weight across Harlan County, Kansas, and began to show what it intended. The first morning, Winifred Dunmore counted her wood and got the wrong answer she did not tell anyone. It was the last week of November, and the night before had been the coldest of the season so far, the kind of cold that arrives not gradually but all at once, as if a door has been opened somewhere north of everything. She had added wood to the stove twice, once before she slept, and once when she woke in the deep middle of the night to check on Wilbur, and she had lain back down on her platform and listened to the wind working against the outside of the silo and felt the temperature in the room hold where it was not shifting, not bleeding away toward the stone, just staying. In the morning, she stood beside the woodpile and counted what she had used against what she knew she would have used in the old farmhouse on a night of comparable cold. She did the arithmetic twice because the first answer seemed wrong. Then she stood very still with the numbers in her head and looked at the stacked wood and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was not satisfaction, but a kind of careful, almost suspicious wonder. The number was less than a third of what a night like that would have cost her in a frame house. Less than a third. She had budgeted for a hard winter based on everything she knew from 12 years of keeping a home on the Kansas plains, and she had cut those numbers conservatively because she was a woman alone with 2 children and a finite capacity for splitting wood, and what the count was telling her now was that her conservative estimate was still nearly 3 times too high. She did not allow herself to feel relieved. Something that good required watching. She set the thought aside and went about her morning, but the numbers stayed with her the way numbers do when they mean something larger than themselves. She allowed herself one long breath. Then she picked up her axe and went out to split the day's wood. Laverna Hartwell came by that afternoon. She had been coming by roughly once a week since October, always, without announcing herself, always staying long enough to be useful, and not so long as to become a burden, which is a social calculation that takes real intelligence to make correctly. This time she sat with Winifred at the small table Winifred had built against the curve of the east wall, and they drank coffee from the small store Winifred was rationing carefully, and Laverna watched the interior of the silo with the particular attention of a woman who has run a household through 20 prairie winters and knows what inadequate shelter feels like from the inside. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at the stove, and then at the walls, and then at Winifred. Jabez thinks you're burning through your wood faster than you're letting on, she said. Jabez is wrong, Winifred said. Laverna was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I stopped by last week and I felt it then. The room held differently than I expected. I didn't say anything to Jabez because... She stopped. Because he would have needed to come see for himself, Winifred said. Yes. Winifred looked at her coffee. He'll come when he's ready. He'll come, Laverna said when he can no longer avoid it. Those are not always the same moment with Jabez. This was said without bitterness, with the matter-of-fact precision of a woman who has spent decades understanding a particular man's relationship with the things he does not want to know. Winifred recognized something in it. She thought about Phineas and the strong box and the burning house and decided not to say what she was thinking. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass in long, slow waves. The temperature inside the silo did not move at all. The pressure from town had not ended with Reverend Ingram's visit. In the second week of December, Ingram came again. This time he brought Martha Hensley. Martha Hensley was the wife of the county's most prominent merchant, a woman in her mid-50s who had arrived in Harlan County from Ohio 20 years ago with opinions already fully formed and the social standing to make them consequential. She was not unkind. She was the kind of woman who mistakes certainty for competence, which is a forgivable error in people who are also genuinely capable, and Martha Hensley was genuinely capable in most of the areas her life required her to operate in. She had simply never encountered Winifred Dunmore operating in an area Martha Hensley had not considered. They arrived on a Thursday morning when the temperature had dropped enough to put a skin of ice on the water troughs by dawn. Winifred saw them coming from a distance and felt her jaw tighten. She opened the silo door before they knocked. Reverend Ingram made introductions that were not necessary. Martha Hensley stepped inside and Winifred did not speak. She let the space do its work. Martha stood in the center of the room and looked. She looked at the floor, solid and level, with no trace of the mud that had been the condition of every exterior surface for a week. She looked at Flossie and Wilbur at the far end of the room, Flossie reading to her brother from a school book, both of them dressed in ordinary indoor clothing, no blankets, no extra layers. She looked at the small stove and the modest stack of wood beside it. She looked at the curved walls with their lining of boards and burlap, and the way the whole interior held a quality of stillness that was distinct from the air outside. She stood there for what felt to Reverend Ingram like a long time. Then she said in a tone that was neither approving nor dismissive, but carried the weight of someone revising an assumption, "This is unconventional." She looked at Winifred when she said it. Winifred met her eyes and waited. Martha Hensley nodded once slowly, the way people nod when they are filing something away, and walked back outside. Ingram followed her. Winifred stood in the doorway and watched them ride toward town and breathed out slowly through her nose. She turned back inside and found Flossie watching her from across the room. "Was that good or bad?" Flossie asked. "It was neither," Winifred said. "It was honest. That's enough for now." But the following week, Kimball Kincaid came to the property, and what he brought was worse than Martha Hensley's ambivalence. Kimball was a capable farmer, a decent neighbor in the practical sense of the word, and a man whose primary mode of understanding the world was through the lens of how things had always been done. Not out of lack of imagination, but out of the genuine and not entirely misguided belief that what has survived long enough to become tradition has usually earned its place. He was not malicious toward Winifred. He was, in his own estimation, trying to help. He told her there were conversations happening in town about the county office, about the children, about what constituted adequate provision for minors in winter conditions. He told her this the way a man tells someone bad news he believes is coming, regardless, as a warning that might allow her to act before she was acted upon. "I'm telling you this," he said, "because there is still time to make a different arrangement, for the children's sake." Winifred looked at him for a long moment. "Kimball," she said, "your children are warm because of decisions Tabitha makes that you don't always understand. Think about that before you come here again to tell me what adequate provision looks like." Kimball's face changed in a way he could not entirely control. Not anger, something more uncomfortable than anger, which is the expression of a man who has been told something true that he was not prepared to hear. He rode away. Winifred watched him go and felt the particular exhaustion of having to be right about everything at once: the management of the cold and the wood supply, and the construction, and the children, and now the county office, all of it requiring her full attention, all of the time with no margin for error, and no one to share the weight of it. Tabitha Kincaid appeared the next morning before breakfast. She came in without knocking, which Winifred had come to understand was Tabitha's way of signaling that she considered the visit private and did not want to give Winifred the option of deflecting her at the threshold. She sat down at the small table and looked at Winifred with the directness that had made her both valued and uncomfortable in Harlan County for 2 decades. "Kimball told me what he said to you," Tabitha said. "It's fine," Winifred said. "It is not fine," Tabitha said, "and I told him so." Not gently. She paused. "The county office business is nothing. Martha Hensley told 2 people privately that what she saw here was not a situation requiring intervention. Those conversations will stop." Winifred absorbed this. "How do you know what Martha said?" "Because I asked her directly," Tabitha said, "which is how you find out what people actually think as opposed to what they're willing to say in front of their husbands." Winifred almost smiled. She poured Tabitha coffee. "There is one more thing," Tabitha said. She held her cup and looked at it. "Mercer wants to come over, to look at what you've done, not to judge it, to understand it." Mercer was Kimball's eldest son, 22 years old, with his mother's practical intelligence, and unlike his father, the willingness to act on what he learned. Winifred had watched him work on the Kincaid property from a distance and recognized the quality of attention he brought to problems. She had wondered when he would show up. "Tell him to come," she said. Mercer Kincaid arrived on a Saturday afternoon in the second week of December, when the temperature outside had reached the point where the air tasted like metal, and the sky had gone the particular flat white that in Kansas means the weather has not yet finished with you. He came inside and stood in the center of the room and looked the way his mother looked at things, thoroughly and without hurry. He looked at the floor, and at the stovepipe, and at the spacing of the sleeping platforms, and at the wood supply, and at the angle of the small south window. He was quiet for long enough that Wilbur, who had been watching him from the sleeping platform with the total frankness of a 6-year-old, finally said, "It's warmer in here than outside." "I can see that," Mercer said, still looking at the walls. He looked at Winifred's woodpile and then looked at the dimensions of the room and then looked at the stove, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man doing arithmetic that is not producing the result he expected. He said quietly, more to himself than to Winifred, "This doesn't add up." "No," Winifred said. "It doesn't, not if you're used to square rooms." Mercer looked at her. He looked back at the walls. He nodded once slowly, the way his mother nodded when she was filing something away that would become useful later. He stayed another half hour asking questions that were good enough that Winifred answered all of them without reservation. And when he left, she felt the peculiar lightness of having been understood by someone who had the capacity to use what they understood. That evening, the Mercer told his father what he had seen. Kimball listened and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Don't repeat that." Mercer had already told Tabitha. The cold deepened through the second half of December in the way that experienced Kansas farmers recognized as a prelude rather than a condition in itself. The cold that arrives before the real cold, the wind that strengthens before the wind that means business. Jabez Hartwell was burning wood faster than he had planned, and the margin he had built into his supply was thinning at a rate that kept waking him in the middle of the night, with the arithmetic already running in his head before he was fully conscious. He did not go to the silo. He did not go because going meant seeing something that would require him to reorganize information he had been certain of for decades, information about how buildings work and how cold moves and what a person who knows the land can and cannot accomplish with salvaged lumber in a stone cylinder. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had built his competence carefully over many years, and who understood at some level he was not yet ready to examine directly that what Winifred Dunmore might be doing in that silo represented a kind of knowledge he had not possessed. And a man can tolerate being wrong in ways that do not touch the center of what he believes about himself, but this particular wrongness had a shape that went deeper than a single winter's miscalculation. Laverna watched her husband and did not push. She had learned over 25 years that pushing Jabez toward a thing he was not ready to see produced only resistance, while waiting produced eventually motion. She went to the silo herself in the third week of December, on a morning when Jabez had ridden to the south pasture and she had the hours to herself. She sat with Winifred and they talked in the way that women who are not close friends but share a significant amount of practical reality sometimes talk directly and without the social architecture that other kinds of relationships require. Laverna said that Jabez's wood supply was worrying him and that he was not sleeping well. She did not say this as a complaint. She said it as information. Winifred said, "The offer stands. If he wants to come and look, he's welcome." "He knows that," Laverna said. "That's part of what's keeping him away." Winifred looked at her. "Accepting help from someone you've publicly called foolish," Laverna said, "is its own kind of winter." Winifred thought about this. She thought about the county office conversations, and Martha Hensley, and Kimball Kincaid, and Reverend Ingram, and Remington, and all the people who had stood at the perimeter of what she was doing and decided they understood it better than she did. She thought about Phineas and the strongbox and the sound the roof made when it finally came down. "Tell him," Winifred said, "that the door is always open." Wilbur Dunmore got sick in the last week of December. It was not serious in the medical sense of the word. Not diphtheria, not the lung sickness that had taken children in the county in other winters, just a hard chest cold of the kind that 6-year-olds collect and carry and spread and eventually survive. But the sound of his coughing in the enclosed space of the silo was the sound of vulnerability. And Winifred had been operating for 4 months on the premise that the children were the reason the work was worth doing, and hearing Wilbur cough in the night, with the January wind starting to pick up outside, undid something in her chest that no amount of correct arithmetic could fully repair. She sat beside him on his sleeping platform for 3 nights, her back against the curved stone wall, one hand on his chest to feel his breathing, not sleeping more than an hour at a stretch. Flossie lay on her own platform across the room and did not sleep either, and the two of them existed in a kind of silent shared vigil that had no words adequate to it and did not require any. On the second morning, Jabez Hartwell rode past on his way to check the creek crossing and heard Wilbur coughing through the door of the silo. He stopped his horse. He sat there for a long moment, a big man on a bay horse in the white winter light, not moving. Then he turned around and rode home and told Laverna what he had heard. Laverna was already putting on her coat. She arrived at the silo within the hour, knocked once, and came in. She found Winifred sitting on the edge of Wilbur's platform, her face carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who has not slept properly in several nights and is running on something beyond the ordinary fuels. Laverna did not ask questions. She looked at Wilbur, felt his forehead with the back of her hand, looked at his color, listened to his breathing for a moment. Then she sat down beside Winifred. She looked at the stove and looked at the wood supply and looked at the temperature the room was holding, and she said it quietly, almost to herself, the way you say a thing when you are still in the process of understanding it. "Winifred, this room is warmer than mine." Winifred did not answer. She was looking at Wilbur. "I mean it," Laverna said. "Not comfortable. Warmer. What you've built here is actually warmer than my house. Winifred said, he'll be all right. Yes, Laverna said, he will. She paused. Because it's warm enough in here for a sick child to recover. That is not nothing, Winifred. She stayed until midday. She brought willow bark tea from her own supply and showed Flossie how to prepare it because Flossie was the kind of 9-year-old who needed to be given a task she could execute correctly rather than reassurance she could not absorb. Flossie prepared the tea with complete seriousness and administered it to Wilbur with the gravity that made Winifred look away because what she felt watching her daughter was too large for the room. Wilbur's fever broke on the 4th morning. He woke up demanding food, which was the reliable signal that the worst had passed, and Flossie, who had been quiet and watchful for 4 days, went outside to see to Dandy without being asked, and stood for a long time in the cold yard by herself before coming back in, and Winifred did not ask her what she was thinking because she knew. That night, after Wilbur was asleep, Flossie lay on her platform in the dark and said, I'm sorry for what I said about never forgiving you. Winifred reached across the space between the platforms in the dark. Flossie took her hand. You were frightened, Winifred said. You were right to be frightened. Being frightened and being wrong are not the same thing. Flossie was quiet for a moment. Are you frightened? She asked. Every day, Winifred said. It doesn't help to pretend otherwise. Another silence. Then Flossie said, the room is warm, though. Yes, Winifred said, the room is warm. She held her daughter's hand until Flossie's breathing changed, and she slept. And Winifred lay in the dark and listened to the wind outside and the silence of the temperature inside that particular quality of stillness that a space achieves when it has been built correctly for its purpose, and felt the weight of the winter and the wood supply and the county office and Jabez Hartwell's unasked questions all at once, and felt something else alongside all of it, quieter and more durable than any of those things, which was the knowledge that she had been right. January was coming. She had known it was coming since September. She had built for it since October. She had nothing left to do now but let it arrive. Mercer Kincaid appeared at the silo door on a morning in the last days of December with a measuring tape in his coat pocket and a piece of paper folded small. He came in and spent an hour moving through the space with the tape measuring wall thickness and floor area and ceiling height and the distance from the stove to the sleeping platforms, writing numbers on the paper with the careful attention of a young man who has decided to build something and wants to build it correctly. Winifred watched him work without interrupting. When he was nearly done, he turned to her and said, my father doesn't know I'm here. I gathered that, she said. He'll know when I start building, Mercer said. That's fine. I'd rather ask the right questions first and answer for them later than skip the questions and get the winter wrong. He looked at his measurements. How far off the floor do the sleeping platforms need to be? She told him. He wrote it down. She showed him the junction points in the roof frame that Remington had questioned and explained how the load traveled around the circle. She showed him the gap between the interior wall lining and the stone face and explained why that gap mattered. She showed him where the stovepipe collar met the roof and how she had sealed it against weather while still allowing the pipe to expand with heat. Mercer took notes on all of it. When he left, he said, the part I didn't understand before was why round. I thought it was just what was available, but the circle is the reason it works. One of the reasons, Winifred said. Yes, he said, one of the reasons. He looked at his paper and then at the walls. I'll get it right. She believed him. That evening, Jabez Hartwell sat in his storage shed after supper with a lamp and the piece of paper he had been carrying folded in his shirt pocket since the first week of December. He smoothed it on his knee and looked at the numbers again. The wood supply had not improved with rereading. Outside, the wind was building in the northwest and the temperature was dropping toward a range that the old-timers in the county had been talking about with the specific quietness that experienced people use when they are genuinely concerned. He had heard from Laverna that Wilbur Dunmore was recovered. He had heard from Laverna that Mercer Kincaid had been to the silo with a measuring tape. He had heard in the way that Jabez Hartwell always heard things about this particular situation, which was reluctantly and later than everyone else, that Mercer was planning to build something in the spring. He folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. The old-timers in town were saying that the geese had moved south 3 weeks early this year. They were saying the woolly bears had been thick on the roads in October. They were saying they had not seen signs like this since the winter of 1886, the one that had killed cattle across 3 territories and broken men who had survived everything else the plains had offered. Jabez turned the lamp down and sat in the dark for a moment. Then he looked west, the direction he had been looking west all autumn, toward a light he could not see, but knew was there burning small and steady against the black. And he thought about a woman with her hands pressed flat against cold stone, in a room he had called foolish, and about the numbers on the paper in his pocket, and about January, which had not yet spoken, but which everyone who had lived on this land long enough could feel gathering itself somewhere to the north, patient and immense, and entirely without interest in who was right. The second week of January arrived the way the old-timers had been predicting since October, not as a gradual deepening of existing cold, but as something categorically different, a change in the nature of winter rather than its degree. The people of Harlan County who had lived through the hard winter of 1886 recognized it by instinct before any thermometer confirmed it. There was a quality to the air at dawn on the 8th of January that was not merely cold but final, as if the season had made a decision and was now executing it without further deliberation. The wind came out of the northwest before sunrise and did not stop. It drove snow horizontally across every open surface, built it into drifts against every windward wall, every fence line, every north face of every structure the county possessed. By mid-morning, the temperature had dropped to a point where exposed skin registered pain within minutes, and the cattle in Jabez Hartwell's south pasture were standing with their backs to the wind in a tight group, heads down, conserving whatever warmth their bodies could still produce. Jabez lost 2 of them before the week was out. He found them on the morning of the third day, stiff in the snow on the lee side of the fence, and he stood looking at them with his hat pulled low and felt the loss, the way a man who has ranched for 20 years feels the loss of animals, which is not sentimental but is real because they represented feed and labor and planning and money that the spring would now require him to replace. He went back to the house and told Laverna, and then went to the storage shed and looked at his wood supply and did not take the paper out of his pocket because he already knew what it said. Across the county, the January blow was settling its weight on structures that had been adequate for ordinary winters and were now being asked to perform beyond their design. At the Kincaid property, Tabitha woke each morning before the children and rebuilt the fire from coals that had dropped dangerously low overnight, wrapping the youngest 2 before she let them out of their sleeping space, watching their breath fog in the corners of the main room, where the heat from the hearth had not reached in the night hours. Kimball was burning wood at a rate that had moved Mercer quietly to begin rationing without telling his father. Mercer had said nothing to anyone about what he had seen at the silo in December. He had said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Yet, no structure built, no proof beyond what Winifred already had, and saying it would have required Kimball to respond to it, which would have required Kimball to position himself in relation to a thing he had not yet decided how to see. Mercer understood his father well enough to know that time and evidence were better arguments than words. He was not wrong, but the time was arriving faster than anyone had anticipated. On the 8th day of the blow, when the wind had been continuous for 4 days, and the temperature had not risen to a point where outdoor work was possible for more than a few minutes at a stretch, Jabez Hartwell saddled his horse in the dark before Laverna was awake and rode west. He told himself, as he had told himself 100 times since October, that he was going to check on the widow and the children. That was true, he was going to check on them. He had also been awake since 3 in the morning with a thought that he could no longer keep at arm's length, which was that if Winifred Dunmore had been right about the stone and the heat and the wood, then everything he had told her on that October afternoon had been wrong, not wrong in a forgivable way, not wrong in the way that reasonable men are sometimes wrong when facing novel situations, but wrong in a way that had tried to stop her from doing the thing that was now keeping 2 children warm while his cattle died in the snow. He had not let himself finish that thought before this morning. This morning he let it finish. He knocked on the silo door. Winifred opened it. The warmth that came through the doorway was not subtle. It was immediate and complete, a wall of stable, even heat that hit Jabez across the face and chest and stopped him where he stood on the threshold. He had been outside for 40 minutes in the January blow. His face was rigid with cold, his fingers numb inside his gloves, his coat inadequate to what the morning had demanded of it. What came out of that doorway was not dramatically different from the air of a warm house in ordinary weather. It was dramatically different from the air of his own house that morning, and it was incomprehensibly different from what was happening outside those stone walls. He stood there longer than was socially warranted, just feeling it before he caught himself and stepped inside. Flossie looked up from where she and Wilbur were sitting on the floor near the stove, playing some game with pebbles that had clearly been going on long enough that they had established complex rules. Both children were wearing what they would have worn in September. Wilbur had taken his shoes off. The stove was burning steadily with the moderate appetite of a fire that is maintaining a condition rather than fighting to establish one. Jabez looked at the wood pile. Flossie said, "We have plenty of wood left, Mr. Hartwell." He looked at the stack against the north curve of the wall. She was telling the truth. It was considerably more than he would have had remaining by this point in a comparable winter. He stood looking at it for a moment, and then he took his hat off and turned it in his hands the way a man does when he needs to do something with his hands, while his mind is working on something he is not ready to speak aloud. He said, "I'll be damned." He said it quietly, not as a performance, not for Winifred's benefit, but as the involuntary acknowledgement of a man whose internal accounting has just been corrected in a way that requires him to revise several columns at once. Winifred was pouring coffee. Laverna Hartwell stepped through the door 30 seconds after Jabez. She had followed him at a distance on her own horse without discussing it. Jabez turned at the sound of the door and then had looked at his wife and understood that she had known where he was going before he had finished deciding to go, which was the kind of thing that happens in long marriages where one person has been paying closer attention than the other realized. Laverna came in and closed the door behind her. She did not speak immediately. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the temperature the space was holding, looked at the children on the floor, looked at the stove's easy burn, looked at Winifred's face, and then she closed her eyes for just a moment, a single breath, the gesture of a woman setting down something she has carried for a long time without having a place to put it. When she opened her eyes, Winifred was watching her. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying between them that had not already been established across the previous months in increments in Laverna's visits, in her silences, in her one quiet observation beside Wilbur's sickbed, and what passed between them in that moment was not information, but confirmation. Winifred handed Jabez his coffee. He took it and sat on the edge of the sleeping platform and wrapped both hands around the cup and did not speak for a while. Laverna sat beside him. The wind outside was doing its full work against every surface it could find, and inside the temperature did not move. Wilbur looked up from his pebble game at Jabez and said with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to soften observation, "You look cold, Mr. Hartwell." "I am cold," Jabez said. "It's warm in here," Wilbur said, and went back to his game. Jabez drank his coffee and looked at the walls and looked at the floor and looked at the ceiling where the stovepipe disappeared through its collar and looked at the small, wavy south window with its rectangle of white winter light, and he did not say what he was thinking, which was that he had stood 40 feet from this building in October and told this woman she was going to born her children and that the children were now warm and easy and unhurried, while outside the January blow was stripping the county down to its essentials. He finished his coffee. He stood up and put his hat back on. He said to Winifred, "Thank you for the coffee." Then he said quietly, looking at the wall rather than at her, "The sod roof was the right call. I didn't think it would hold the weight." It was the closest Jabez Hartwell would come that morning to saying what was true. Winifred heard everything in it. She said, "It distributed the load the same way the frame did. The circle helps." Jabez nodded. He went to the door and opened it, and the cold came in immediately, and he stepped out into it without hesitation, because he was that kind of man, and Laverna followed him, and Winifred stood in the doorway and watched them ride east into the white morning. 3 days after Jabez's visit, Kimball Kincaid stopped at the Hartwell property to return a borrowed tool and found Jabez in the storage shed stacking wood that had just arrived from town, purchased at the winter premium rate. That meant Jabez had run through his original supply. Kimball stood in the door of the shed and looked at the new wood and did not say anything for a moment. Jabez kept stacking. "You went over there," Kimball said. Not a question. Jabez stacked another piece of wood. "I did." Kimball looked at the pile. Outside, the wind was working at the corner of the shed roof with a persistence that made the whole structure creak. He said Mercer wants to build one in the spring. He's been planning it since December. Jabez set down the piece of wood he was holding and turned to look at Kimball. Kimball was staring at the middle distance in the way of a man arranging words for something he does not particularly want to say. "He asked me to help with the framing," Kimball said. "Are you going to?" Jabez asked. Kimball was quiet for a moment. It means I was wrong about the whole thing, he said, about what she was doing, about what she understood. Jabez looked at him. No, he said. It means she was right. Those aren't the same thing. Kimball looked at Jabez. Jabez looked back at him. Two men in their middle years standing in a shed full of purchased wood, with a wind that had been running for the better part of 2 weeks pressing at the walls around them. The distinction Jabez had drawn was not a comfort exactly. It was a precision. It did not reduce the wrongness, but it located it correctly, which is a different kind of thing and sometimes a necessary one. Kimball picked up the piece of wood Jabez had set down and fitted it onto the stack. All right, he said. They worked in silence for a while, the two of them stacking the wood that the winter had made necessary. The January blow ran another 2 weeks beyond Jabez's visit to the silo. Harlan County would talk about that winter for decades, not with the romance that distant suffering sometimes acquires, but with a specific detailed memory of people who were present for it. The schoolhouse in town closed for close to 3 weeks because there was no fuel sufficient to keep it warm enough for children to sit still in. 3 families in the eastern part of the county burned through their wood supply entirely and were kept from genuine danger only by contributions from neighbors who had more than they needed, and those neighbors were fewer than anyone would have wished. Winifred Dunmore did not contribute wood because she was not asked. What she contributed in the weeks after the worst of the blow had passed was something harder to quantify. Reverend Ingram came to the silo at the end of January. He came alone without Martha Hensley, without institutional purpose, with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has been working up to something for a while and has finally decided to stop working up to it and do it. He said, I owe you an apology, Mrs. Dunmore. I came here twice last autumn with the intention of protecting your children. I should have come with the intention of understanding what you were doing. I confused those two things, and I am sorry for it. Winifred looked at him for a moment. He was a man in his late 50s who had spent his career trying to do good in ways that the people he was trying to do good to did not always recognize as good, and he had enough self-knowledge to understand that and enough honesty to name it when it applied. She stepped back from the door. Come in, Reverend. Coffee's hot. He sat at the small table and they talked for an hour. Not about the silo or the winter, but about the county and the people in it and the spring that was coming, and it was the first conversation Winifred had had with someone from town that felt like a conversation between equals rather than a negotiation. When he left, he shook her hand. She watched him ride toward town and felt the winter show off slightly around her. Not warmer, but different, as if the social cold that had pressed against her since October was beginning to release its hold in the way that the January blow itself was finally grudgingly beginning to ease. The thaw came in the way Kansas thaws always come gradually, and then all at once, the snow retreating first from the south faces and then from the open ground, the mud season arriving to make everything difficult in ways that were merely inconvenient rather than dangerous. Winifred Dunmore stood outside the silo on a morning in early March and looked at the land and felt the full weight of what she had done and what had been done to her and what had survived all of it, and breathed the air that was just beginning to carry the first suggestion of something other than cold. Jabez came in April. He came with paper and a stub of pencil in the manner of a man who has made a decision and is executing it without drama, which is the only way Jabez Hartwell knew how to execute decisions. He asked about the roof frame first, the angle of the layers, how she had calculated the spacing. He wrote down what she told him. He asked about the stove placement, and she explained it, and he wrote that down. He asked about the wall lining, what material, how thick, how fastened, and she showed him what she had done, and he looked at it carefully and wrote. He did not apologize. Winifred had not expected him to. What Jabez Hartwell was doing instead of apologizing was learning, which is a more demanding act and in its way more honest. An apology takes a moment. What Jabez was doing in that shed with his pencil and his paper would take the rest of the summer to build and would last through winters that had not yet arrived. She did not make it easy or difficult. She answered every question fully and without the satisfaction that she might have been entitled to, because the satisfaction would have been about her and what she needed from Jabez. And what mattered now is that the knowledge got used. Mercer Kincaid came on a Saturday with Tabitha, and the two of them spent an afternoon walking around the exterior of the silo with Winifred, while Mercer asked questions that were better than Jabez's. Not because Jabez was less intelligent, but because Mercer had been thinking about this since December and had arrived with specific problems he needed to solve, rather than a general desire to understand. He asked about the foundation, about drainage, about how she had managed the sod roof through the thaw without losing the seal. Tabitha contributed observations about the interior that surprised even Winifred, details Tabitha had registered on her visits that Winifred had not realized she was cataloging. Kimball Kincaid stood outside the silo while this happened. He did not come in. He stood near the door with his arms folded and his eyes moving across the exterior of the building. The stone walls, the sod roof, the south window, the way the rise of earth came up against the lower walls on three sides. He was not approving or disapproving. He was looking the way his son looked, the way his wife looked, with the attention of someone who was trying to understand something they did not understand before. After a while, Flossie came out and stood near him. She was 9 years old, and she had her mother's quality of stillness, the ability to occupy space without requiring it to accommodate her. Kimball looked down at her. "Your mother built this," he said. "Yes," Flossie said. "In 2 months, with salvaged wood and a silo nobody had used in a decade." "Yes," Flossie said again. She looked at the exterior of the building. She'd been thinking about it longer than 2 months, though. She'd been thinking about it for years. She just didn't know she was thinking about it. Kimball looked at the 9-year-old for a moment. Then he looked back at the building. "I'll be helping Mercer with his framing this summer," he said. Not to Flossie particularly, to the air, to the building, to the general space that included Flossie and the silo and the spring morning and everything the winter had established. Flossie said, "I'll tell Mama." She went inside. Kimball stood for another minute looking at the stone walls, and then he walked over to where Mercer was asking Winifred about the foundation drainage, and he listened. By the summer of 1892, there were 2 new structures going up in Harlan County that bore the influence of what Winifred Dunmore had done. Neither of them was a converted silo. The materials for that were not available. But both were built with walls thicker than anything their owners had previously built, with stoves positioned with attention to where the warmth would go and where the people would sleep, with floors raised and wall cavities packed. Both builders had spent time at Winifred's silo asking questions. Both of them told the story of January when they explained why they were building the way they were building. Mercer Kincaid's structure was the better of the two. He had taken the most careful notes and had the most specific understanding of the principles involved, and he had his mother's ability to apply what he learned without losing the intelligence of it in the execution. When it was done, Tabitha walked through it and said it was right, which was the highest form of praise Mercer had ever received from her, and which he understood was high praise, precisely because she gave it rarely. Remington, the construction man from town who had said the roof angles were wrong, came to look at Mercer's finished building in August. He walked through it alone without speaking to anyone and spent a long time at the wall junctions and the stovepipe collar and the floor framing. When he came out, he told Mercer that the execution was sound and that there were 2 details he would have done differently. He named them and explained why. Mercer wrote both details down. They were correct observations, and Mercer incorporated them when he built the second structure 2 years later. Remington never spoke directly to Winifred about any of this. What he did instead was accurate and practical and conducted entirely without requiring her forgiveness, which was consistent with who he was and which Winifred found, when she thought about it, less unsatisfying than she might have expected. Winifred Dunmore lived in the silo for 4 winters. In the autumn of 1895, with money saved from 2 good harvests and a small sum that Tabitha Kincaid had lent her interest-free in the spring of 1893, in a transaction that was never discussed publicly and that Kimball knew about because Tabitha told him, and that was never contested, Winifred built a proper house on the Dunmore property. The house was not round. The materials and the site did not allow for it, but it was built with thick walls on 3 sides and a protected north face with a central hearth system that put heat into the rooms rather than through the walls, with sleeping lofts positioned where the warm air rose to, with a floor plan that eliminated the long exposed corridors that bled heat in ordinary houses. It was a house that knew where its winters came from and had been built accordingly. The silo stood. Nobody tore it down because nobody had reason to, and because structures built by someone who understood what they were doing have a tendency to outlast the purposes for which they were built and find new ones. It was used for grain storage for a decade, and then for equipment shelter, and then for other things as the property's needs shifted, but its walls remained sound into the new century, and anyone who went inside it in winter could still feel what Winifred had felt the first time, that quality of the cold, being further away than the wall suggested it had any right to be. Flossie Dunmore grew up and married and moved to a neighboring county and had children of her own. She told the story of the silo, the way her mother had wanted it told, not as a lesson and not as a parable, and not as a tribute to female resilience or frontier ingenuity, but as something that had actually happened to people she had known, which is the most powerful framing any story can have, because it asks the listener not to admire from a distance, but to recognize something close. When her own children asked whether their grandmother had been afraid, Flossie answered them the way Winifred had answered her on that January night, with Wilbur asleep and the wind outside and the silo holding its temperature against everything the season could put against it. She said every single night, and she kept building anyway. That's the only kind of brave that counts. Jabez Hartwell built differently after that winter. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the structures he raised on his property in the years following 1892 were altered in ways that anyone paying attention could measure in wall thickness and stove placement and the care given to floor construction. He did not announce these changes. He did not explain them to anyone who did not ask. If anyone asked, he said he had learned something. The winter of 1893, Jabez stood in his storage shed on a night in mid-January, which was cold, but not the kind of cold that 1892 had been, and counted his wood. The numbers came out right. He had enough and more than enough, and he had built the shed addition in October with doubled walls and a tight floor, and his wood was staying drier and more protected than it had in previous years, and the numbers were right. He put the paper in his pocket and turned the lamp down. Before he went back to the house, he looked west out of habit, the direction he had been looking west for 2 years. The night was clear and the stars were hard and bright, the way prairie winter stars are, and there was a light in the distance that he knew was Winifred Dunmore's house, the new one she had finished in November, its single window sending a thin, warm line out across the dark. He looked at it for a moment. Then he thought about what it had taken, not the building, though the building had taken plenty. What it had taken before the building, in the months when everyone around her was telling her what she could not do, and she had nothing to stand on except what she had felt with her own hands against cold stone in the dark. He thought about the night she must have spent with Wilbur coughing in the wind outside, and 2 children whose safety was entirely contingent on whether a conviction she could not prove to anyone else turned out to be correct. He thought about what it costs to trust a thing you know before you have the language to explain it to the people around you. He had been asking himself quietly and without the comfort of an easy answer, a question that had first formed itself on the morning he stood in the doorway of the silo and felt that warmth. Not why had she been right? That was the easy question. The harder question was why he had been so certain she was wrong. He was a man who had survived 20 winters on the Kansas plains by trusting what he knew. And what he had failed to account for was that Winifred Dunmore had also been surviving on this land alongside him, learning from the same seasons with the same quality of attention that he trusted in himself. And he had not extended to her the basic assumption that what she had seen was as real as what he had seen. He had no answer for why. He had only the question and the obligation to carry it honestly, and the walls he was building differently because of it. The lamp was down. He walked back across the yard to his house, his boots leaving prints in the thin crust of snow, the cold working at the back of his neck, where his collar did not quite reach. Above him, the stars were doing what stars do in a Kansas winter, which is everything they can against the dark, which turns out to be enough. In the house, Laverna had left a lamp burning on the table. He came in and took his coat off and hung it and stood for a moment in the warmth of the room, his room with its fire built the way he had learned to build it, and its walls thicker than they had been, and its floor tight against the cold. It was not the warmth of Winifred's silo on that January morning. It was his own warmth built with what he knew and what he had been willing to learn. He sat down at the table. Laverna's chair was empty. He could hear her upstairs, the quiet sounds of a house at rest. He thought about the woman who had pressed her palms against cold stone in the dark and trusted what they told her. He thought about Flossie saying, "It feels like being inside a hill," and Winifred saying, "Close the door, keep it in." He thought about Wilbur recovered and asking for food, and Flossie across the room holding her mother's hand. He thought about the best answers being already in the landscape, waiting for someone patient enough to look. Outside, the Kansas night pressed its cold against every surface it could find, the way it always had and always would. Inside, the fire held.